The city exhaled a breath of cold, damp air that clung to Elena's skin like a second, unwanted layer. She sat on a bench, the iron slats pressing hard against her bones, a cruel reminder of every bed she no longer had. At 8 months pregnant, her body was a vessel of life in a world that felt dead to her. People rushed past, their faces illuminated by phone screens, their lives moving at a speed she could no longer comprehend. They were warm, they were going somewhere. She was just dear, a statue of forgotten promises, invisible to the hurried eyes of strangers. Her hands cradled her belly, a protective gesture that was as instinctual as breathing. Inside, a small life fluttered, a secret warmth in the vast, unfeeling cold of her reality. Hunger was a constant companion, a dull ache that had sharpened into a piercing pain over the past 2 days. It wasn't her own emptiness that terrified her, it was the stillness she felt within. The baby, usually so active, was quiet. A cold dread, far worse than the evening chill, washed over her. She imagined the tiny life inside her, depending on her for everything, and she was failing. The aroma of grilled meat and fresh bread wafted from a nearby restaurant, a form of torture that made her stomach clench with a desperate, hollow cramp. It was the smell of a life she couldn't provide, a world separated from her by a pane of glass. She wasn't just hungry for food. She was starving for a chance. Everywhere she looked, she saw judgment. The security guard who told her to move along, his eyes sweeping over her swollen belly with disdain. The woman who pulled her child closer as Elena passed, as if poverty were a contagious disease. The averted gazes, the whispers, the doors that remained firmly shut. Each rejection was a small paper cut on a soul already bleeding. She remembered a time when she had a name, a place, a future. Now she was just a problem for others to solve, or more often, to ignore. But beneath the worn-out jacket and the exhaustion in her eyes, a flicker of defiance remained. They could take her home, her money, her hope, but they could not take her dignity. Not entirely. The memory of him was a ghost that haunted her waking hours. His smile, once a source of comfort, now felt like a betrayal. The day she told him she was pregnant, that smile had vanished, replaced by a cold, hard mask. "It's not my problem," he had said, the words echoing the final slam of a door. He had walked away from her, from their child, without a second glance, leaving her on a crumbling precipice. That abandonment was a wound deeper than any hunger, a loneliness that seeped into her bones. She was an orphan once more, cast out not by fate, but by choice, his choice. And so she learned to rely on no one but herself and the fierce, protective love she felt for the child he had so easily discarded. As night fell, the city lights blurred through her unshed tears. The baby kicked, a faint but determined nudge against her ribs. It was a sign, a plea. It was a reminder that her fight was not over. Her exhaustion warred with a primal, maternal instinct that was far more powerful. Her gaze fell upon the alley beside the luxury restaurant, where shadows danced and the city hid its refuse. A desperate plan began to form in her mind, born not of malice or greed, but of a mother's fierce, unwavering love. She would not fail this child. She would do what she had to do, no matter the cost to her pride. Because in a world that had given her nothing, her baby was everything. The alley was a throat that swallowed light, smelling of discarded luxury and damp concrete. Eleanor's hesitation was a physical weight, a force holding her back, but the silence from within her womb was a stronger one, pushing her forward. The baby hadn't moved in hours, and a cold, primal fear eclipsed her shame. This wasn't for her. The hunger gnawing at her own stomach was a dull, familiar ache she could endure. But the potential hunger of her child was an agony she could not. She watched the restaurant's heavy steel door, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. In this forgotten space between worlds, a mother's instinct was about to declare war on a society that had already declared her invisible. She moved like a phantom, hugging the shadows of the brick wall. Each step was a negotiation between her pride and her baby's survival. A young man in a stained white apron emerged, dragging 2 heavy black bags. He didn't see her. To him, the alley was just the end of a long shift, a place to dump the day's excess. He tossed the bags near a large dumpster with a grunt and disappeared back inside, the door sighing shut behind him. For a moment, Elena stood frozen. Those bags, filled with what others considered waste, represented a grotesque form of hope. It was a lifeline she was ashamed to need, but a lifeline she could no longer afford to ignore. Her fingers, numb from the cold, fumbled with the knot on the first bag. The plastic was slick and cold. A wave of smells hit her. Stale bread, wilted greens, the faint sweet scent of discarded pastry. It was the scent of life, of sustenance, of everything she lacked. She didn't dig with greed, but with a surgical desperation, her eyes scanning for anything wrapped, anything clean. Her hand closed around a half loaf of bread, still soft. A tear of relief, hot and sharp, traced a path down her frozen cheek. It was a small victory, a morsel of grace in a world of scarcity, but the relief lasted only for a second, shattered by a sudden, blinding light. "Hey, what do you think you're doing?" A voice, sharp as broken glass, sliced through the silence. A man in a crisp suit, his face a mask of furious indignation, stood in the doorway. It was the restaurant manager. He strode toward her, his expensive shoes crunching on the gravel. "That is restaurant property. Are you a thief?" His accusation echoed off the brick walls, turning her small act of survival into a common crime. He didn't see a desperate mother. He saw vermin, a pest to be eradicated. Elena froze, the bread clutched in her hand like a piece of incriminating evidence, her face illuminated by the harsh, unforgiving light from the doorway. His shouting was a magnet for judgment. Another kitchen worker peered out, his face a mixture of curiosity and contempt. A couple walking past the alley slowed their pace, their expressions hardening as they took in the scene. The well-dressed manager, the overflowing trash bags, and the dirty, pregnant woman caught in the act. "Look at her!" The manager spat, his voice loud enough for the onlookers to hear. No shame. Pregnant and stealing from the trash like an animal. The words were designed to strip her of any remaining dignity, to paint her not as a person in need, but as a public nuisance, a stain on the pristine image of his establishment. The shame burned her cheeks, but it was a different fire that raged inside her, a fierce, protective inferno for her unborn child. She didn't have the strength to form a defense, to explain the quiet terror that had driven her here. Words felt useless against a wall of such solid contempt. Her only instinct was to shield her baby from the venom in his voice. She unconsciously pulled her thin jacket tighter around her belly, a futile gesture of protection. In his eyes, she was a criminal. In her own heart, she was a failure. A mother who couldn't even provide a simple meal without being brought to her knees by public humiliation. The manager, emboldened by his audience, pulled out his phone. "That's it. I'm calling the police. We'll have you arrested for trespassing and theft." The threat hung in the cold air, a promise of cold steel and colder cells. For Elena, the thought of being arrested was a nightmare made real. It meant being separated from her baby, losing the one thing that gave her the will to keep fighting. He saw a crime worth reporting, not a life worth saving. His finger hovered over the screen, a small god wielding the power to dismantle her entire world with a single touch, all for a piece of bread he had already thrown away. She was no longer Elena. She was a spectacle of poverty, a cautionary tale whispered on a cold city night. She stood trapped in the spotlight of his anger, the half loaf of bread still in her hand, a symbol of her crime and her desperation. The faces of the strangers watching were a jury that had already reached its verdict. Guilty. Guilty of being poor, of being hungry, of being pregnant and alone. The manager's voice boomed one last time, sealing her fate. "People like you are a disease in this city." And in that moment, under the weight of his judgment, Elena finally broke. But her surrender would not be what he expected. If this story has touched you, like and share. So many people live this reality in silence. From the warmth of the restaurant, a man emerged, moving with an unnerving stillness that seemed to command the very air around him. This was Damien Velez. His suit was a whisper of dark, expensive fabric, a shield against the world's imperfections. His face was a study in controlled indifference, carved from years of ruthless decisions and buried grief. He owned this building, this block, this small corner of the city, where Eleanor's desperation was playing out like a vulgar piece of street theater. The commotion in the alley was to him a discordant note in a symphony he had meticulously composed. It was an irritation, a flaw in the otherwise pristine surface of his empire. And he was a man who did not tolerate flaws. He stepped fully into the night, the cold air barely registering on his skin. The manager's voice, sharp with indignation, finally broke through his insulated thoughts. Damien's gaze followed the sound, landing on the scene with a cold, analytical precision. He saw the furious employee, the gawking strangers, and at the center of it all, a woman, dirty, pregnant, and cornered. His mind processed the image not with empathy, but with the detached logic of a risk assessment. This was a liability, a stain, a problem that needed to be efficiently and quietly erased before it could tarnish the reputation of his property. Her humanity was irrelevant. Her presence was the only fact that mattered. With measured, deliberate steps, Damien approached the mouth of the alley. His arrival shifted the atmosphere entirely. The manager straightened up, his anger now laced with a sycophantic desire to please. The onlookers fell silent, recognizing the unmistakable aura of power. Damien's eyes, the color of a winter sky, settled on Elena. He did not see a mother-to-be, starving and afraid. He saw a cliché, a textbook case of the urban decay he spent millions to keep at a distance. He catalogued her worn-out clothes, her frightened expression, and the grime on her hands as evidence for a verdict he had already reached long ago. She was not a person. She was a statistic of failure. His gaze then dropped for a fraction of a second to her swollen belly. It was not a glance of compassion. It was a look of profound, almost visceral, disdain. In his mind, a world of locked doors and painful memories, her pregnancy was the ultimate sign of her recklessness. It was a burden she had created, a problem she was now trying to make everyone else's. He felt a deep, cold anger rise within him, an old, familiar ghost. This woman and her unborn child represented a kind of chaos he had sworn to purge from his life. They were a reminder of a vulnerability he had buried under a mountain of wealth and emotional distance, and he hated her for it. Turning to the manager, Damien's voice was flat, devoid of heat, which made it all the more chilling. "Call the police," he commanded, the words cutting through the air like shards of ice. He didn't even look at Elena as he spoke. Her final, brutal act of dismissal that rendered her completely invisible. "I don't want these kinds of people here." It was not a suggestion. It was an execution order for her hope. The matter was closed. He had assessed the situation, identified the problem, and issued the solution. With that, he had already turned his mind to his next meeting, the next deal, the next distraction from the hollow echo in his own soul. The manager, validated and empowered, pulled out his phone with a cruel smile. The silent jury of onlookers seemed to relax, their social order restored. The powerful had spoken, and the weak would be dealt with. To them, justice was being served. For Elena, Damien Velez was not just a man. He was the embodiment of every closed door, every judgmental stare, every person who had ever looked at her and seen only a problem to be disposed of. His cold indifference was a far greater violence than the manager's loud anger. It was the quiet, crushing weight of a world that had decided she was not worth saving, and her child was not worth protecting. In that alley, two universes collided with the force of a silent explosion. His was a world of sterile contracts and calculated acquisitions, where human emotion was a liability and loss was something to be managed and contained. Hers was a world of raw, visceral survival, where a piece of bread was a treasure and a baby's kick was a reason to keep breathing. Damien, the architect of a lonely, gilded cage, had just passed sentence on Elena, a woman whose only crime was a mother's desperate love. The chasm between them seemed absolute, a dark, uncrossable canyon of privilege and pain, and his words had just set the bridge on fire. He thought he was simply cleaning up a minor mess, a human inconvenience staining his property. He believed his command was the end of the interaction, a final, decisive act. But the encounter was not over. It had barely begun. By dismissing her life so casually, by looking at her pregnant belly with such cold contempt, Damien had unknowingly knocked on the door of his own haunted past. He was about to discover that the woman he saw as a worthless vagrant held the key to the very room in his heart he had sealed shut a decade ago. The clash of their worlds was not an ending, it was the beginning of an unraveling. The word "wait" hung in the frigid air, a command that stopped time. Damien Velez did not know why he had said it. The order had escaped his lips before his mind could veto it, an act of rebellion against a decade of practiced indifference. He stared at Elena, still kneeling in the filth, and felt an unfamiliar, unwelcome turmoil. His logic screamed at him. She was a trespasser, a liability, a problem to be disposed of with a single phone call. Yet the image of her hands cradling her belly had unearthed something he had buried deep. He was irritated, not with her, but with himself, for this crack in his armor. He was a man who solved problems, and this woman had just become the most complicated equation he had faced in years. Elena heard the word, but couldn't process it as salvation. To her ears, it sounded like a stay of execution, not a pardon. She looked up from the ground, her eyes meeting Damien's. There was no kindness in his face, only a cold, severe confusion, as if he were angry at her for making him hesitate. Her fear, sharp and paralyzing moments before, began to curdle into a defiant pride. She would not be his spectacle of pity. With a grunt of effort, she pushed herself up, her legs trembling, her body aching with the strain. She would face whatever came next on her feet. She had been brought to her knees by hunger, but she would not let this man's judgment keep her there. She was a mother, and mothers do not beg. The restaurant manager stood frozen, his phone still clutched in his hand like a useless weapon. "Mr. Velez," he stammered, his face a canvas of confusion. "Sir, you said to call them." He needed the world to return to its predictable order, where the powerful punished the weak and rules were ruthlessly enforced. He saw Damien's hesitation as a dangerous crack in the foundation of that order. "She was stealing from our bins. It's a health and safety risk. She's a vagrant." He continued to list her crimes, hoping the familiar, dehumanizing words would jolt his boss back to his senses. He was defending the system, reinforcing the social wall that kept people like Elena on the outside, exactly where he believed she belonged. Damien ignored his employee. He was a man accustomed to resolving conflict with the surgical precision of a financial transaction. This situation, he reasoned, should be no different. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored coat, withdrew a thick leather wallet, and pulled out a wad of cash. Without a word, he extended his hand. The bills fanned out like an offering and an insult all at once. "Take this," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion, "and get out of here. I don't want to see you on my property again." It was not an act of charity. It was a dismissal, a payment to make the uncomfortable ghost of his own past, and the woman who had summoned it, disappear. Eleanor stared at the money, then at the man holding it. The gesture was more humiliating than the manager's shouts. He believed her dignity had a price tag, that a few $100s could erase her desperation and his own disgust. A fire, low and steady, began to burn through her shame. "No," she said, her voice barely a whisper but sharp with conviction. "I don't want your money." The refusal was a thunderclap in the silent alley. For Elena, accepting that cash would be an admission of guilt, a confirmation that she was the thief he believed her to be. It was the only power she had left, the power to refuse to be bought, to insist on being seen as more than a problem money could solve. Her defiance struck Damien like a physical blow. It was incomprehensible. In his world, money was the universal language, the ultimate solution. Her rejection was not just an insult, it was a fundamental disruption of his reality. The manager let out a derisive snort. "Ungrateful," he muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. Damien's frustration mounted, his face hardening back into its familiar, icy mask. "You're living on the street, digging through garbage, and you refuse help," he snarled, the words dripping with contempt. He took a step closer, the chasm between them now filled with a raw, crackling tension. He was being challenged by the most powerless person he had ever met, and it was infuriating. The confrontation, the cold warm, the days of hunger, it was all too much. A wave of blackness washed over Elena. The alley tilted, the harsh lights blurring into streaks. She swayed, her hand flying out to brace herself against the cold, rough brick of the wall. It was a moment of complete, involuntary surrender. Her body, pushed beyond its limits, was betraying her fierce will to stand strong. She squeezed her eyes shut, taking a ragged breath, fighting a battle not against Damien, but against her own physical collapse. This silent display of her profound fragility was more eloquent than any word she could have spoken. It was the undeniable truth of her suffering, made visible for all to see. That small, desperate movement shattered something within Damien. It wasn't an act. It was a collapse. Her weakness was not a manipulation, but a raw, unfiltered reality. In that moment, she was not a vagrant or a problem. She was just a woman, pregnant and utterly exhausted, on the verge of breaking. A memory sharp as a shard of glass pierced through his defenses, his wife, Amelia, 8 months pregnant, leaning against him for support after a short walk, smiling tiredly. "This baby is taking all my energy," she had whispered. The echo of her voice, and silent for 10 years, was deafening. The woman before him was a stranger, yet her struggle felt terrifyingly, painfully familiar. Suddenly, the night was torn apart by the piercing wail of a siren. A police car, its lights painting the alley in frantic strokes of red and blue, screeched to a halt at the curb. Someone must have made the call before Damien had stopped it. 2 officers emerged, their movements efficient and detached. "We received a report of a disturbance," the taller officer announced, his gaze immediately falling upon Eleanor, the obvious source of the problem. The system Damien had almost set in motion had arrived, impersonal and unstoppable. For Elena, the sight of the uniform was the materialization of her deepest fears. It was over. They would take her, and she would lose her baby. The officers began to advance. "Ma'am, you'll need to come with us." The manager crossed his arms, a smug look of vindication on his face. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs, a trapped bird fighting its cage. Just as the first officer reached for her arm, Damien moved. He stepped directly into their path, a solid, unmovable wall between Eleanor and the law. His face was grim, his motives still a mystery even to himself. "There has been a misunderstanding," he stated, his voice calm but imbued with an authority that made the officers freeze. He glanced back at Eleanor, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes, before turning back to the police. "So she's with me. Do you believe in second chances? Comment below. We want to hear from you." Damien's words, "she's with me," hung in the alley like a shield, a declaration that defied all logic. The police officers froze, their professional certainty dissolving into confusion. The manager's jaw went slack, his smug expression replaced by one of utter disbelief. He looked from his boss, the cold, ruthless titan of industry, to the destitute woman cowering by the dumpster, and the 2 images refused to connect in his mind. For Elena, the words were a foreign language she couldn't comprehend. They offered a lifeline, yet she couldn't trust the hand that offered it. In the suffocating silence, broken only by the crackle of the police radio, a man who had built an empire on emotional detachment had just committed his most irrational and human act in a decade. Elena looked up at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and bewilderment. Was this a game? A crueler, more elaborate form of humiliation designed to break her spirit completely before casting her aside? She saw no warmth in his face, only a storm of conflict raging behind his icy blue eyes. He looked like a man at war with himself, his expression a mask of pained resolve. She instinctively tightened her grip on her belly, her only anchor in a world that had suddenly tilted on its axis. This man had been her judge and executioner moments before. She could not believe he was now her savior. Her entire life had taught her that kindness from the powerful always came with a hidden, unbearable price. The officers exchanged a wary glance. They were accustomed to the city's predictable cruelties, to the clear lines drawn between the haves and the have-nots. Damien Velez's claim shattered those lines. "Sir, we had a report of a theft," the taller officer stated, his tone respectful but firm. He was trying to restore order to a situation that no longer made sense. A man like Damien Velez did not associate with a woman like Eleanor. It was a violation of the city's unspoken laws. They stood their ground, waiting for an explanation that would allow them to close their report and forget the unsettling scene. A scene that hinted at a story far more complicated than a simple case of trespassing. But Damien was no longer in the alley. He was standing in a sunlit hospital room 10 years ago, the sterile smell of antiseptic filling his lungs. He saw his wife, Amelia, her hand resting on her own swollen belly as she smiled up at him, her eyes filled with dreams for their unborn son. He heard her voice, a soft melody of hope, talking about the life they would build together. Then, the memory fractured, replaced by the screech of tires, the shattering of glass, and a silence so profound it had swallowed his soul. The wail of the police siren outside the alley was no longer a sound of the present. It was the echo of the ambulance that had arrived too late, the sound that had marked the end of his world. Elena's whispered words to her child, "Forgive me, my love. I'm so sorry I failed you," reverberated in the hollow chamber of his heart. They were the very words he had screamed into the silence of his empty home for years. He had failed Amelia. He had failed their son. In that moment, Eleanor's desperation was no longer a nuisance. It was a sacred reflection of his own deepest guilt. He saw not a thief, but a mother fighting with her last ounce of strength to protect her child, a battle he had lost in the most brutal way imaginable. Her gesture of cradling her belly was not an act of a vagrant, but the universal posture of maternal love, a love he had been denied the chance to witness. He turned to the officers, his voice now imbued with an unshakable, almost serene authority. The internal war was over. "There is no theft," he said, his gaze unwavering. "This woman is a distant relative. She was feeling unwell and became disoriented. My manager did not recognize her and overreacted." The lie was effortless, born of a sudden, fierce need to protect her. "To rewrite this one small story so it wouldn't end in tragedy. I will take full responsibility. You can go." He was no longer just a property owner. He was a guardian, a shield against the very system he had been so quick to weaponize. He was finally taking responsibility, not just for her, but for the ghost of his wife. The manager stared, utterly stupefied. This explanation was more insane than the initial problem. A relative. This woman. He had spent years learning to anticipate Mr. Velez's cold, pragmatic commands, to enforce the sterile perfection he demanded. Now, that same man was creating a fiction, a messy, human lie, to protect the very kind of person he'd always taught his staff to remove. The world had been turned upside down. The rigid lines of power and poverty had blurred into an incomprehensible mess, and the architect of that rigid world was the one holding the eraser. His boss's actions were a betrayal of every rule he had been taught to live by, leaving him stranded in his own judgment. Damien took a slow step toward Eleanor, closing the vast distance that had separated them. He knelt, not in pity, but as if approaching something fragile and sacred. For the first time, he truly looked at her face, seeing past the grime and fear to the profound exhaustion and fierce love in her eyes. "It's all right," he said, his voice quiet, stripped of its earlier harshness. "You are safe now." The words were a vow, a promise made not only to the frightened woman before him, but to the memory that haunted his every waking moment. In saving her, he was desperately trying to save a small piece of himself, to offer the protection he had been unable to give when it mattered most. As the police car pulled away, its flashing lights disappearing into the night, a heavy silence fell upon the alley. Damien rose to his feet and, without a moment of hesitation, shrugged off his dark cashmere overcoat. The garment was his armor, a symbol of his untouchable status and emotional distance. He gently draped it over Elena's trembling shoulders. The coat was impossibly warm, heavy with a safety she had not felt in years. It smelled of wealth, of power, of a world she had only ever seen from the outside. The gesture was a bridge, a tangible act of bringing her out of the cold and into the shelter of his sudden, inexplicable protection. Eleanor clutched the luxurious fabric, the warmth seeping into her frozen bones. She looked up at this impossible man, his face still a mask of sorrow, but the contempt was gone, replaced by a shared pain that needed no words. He wasn't looking at a problem anymore. He was looking at a mother, and in his haunted eyes, she saw the reflection of a father who had lost everything. The tears that finally fell were not of despair, but of a shattering, overwhelming relief. For the first time in a very long time, she was not invisible. In the heart of the city that had forgotten her, in a dirty alley behind a wall of judgment, a broken man had finally seen her. The alley fell into a cathedral-like silence, the echoes of the siren replaced by the sound of two people breathing in the cold night air. Damien stood before her, a statue of newfound, agonizing purpose. The coat draped over her shoulders was a silent contract, an unspoken promise. He cleared his throat, the sound rough and unfamiliar to his own ears. "You cannot stay here," he stated, the words stripped of his earlier cruelty, leaving only a raw, undeniable fact. He gestured toward the street, where a sleek black car waited, its engine a soft, patient hum. "My driver will take you to a hotel. You will have a room, a hot meal, and a safe place to sleep tonight." It wasn't an offer born of warmth, but of necessity. He was a man fixing a problem. Only this time, the problem was a profound injustice he had nearly caused himself. Elena flinched at the command, her instincts screaming that this was a trap, another door that would slam shut the moment she let her guard down. She clutched the lapels of his heavy coat, its warmth a confusing comfort. "Why?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. The question was not an accusation, but a desperate plea for understanding. She needed to know what had shifted behind his cold eyes, what had transformed her from a pest into a person worth his time. Damien's gaze fell, for a moment, to the ground. He could not explain the ghost of his wife, the echo of her laughter, the crushing weight of a decade of grief. "Because no mother should have to search for food in the trash," he said, the admission costing him more than any business deal he had ever made. "And no child should start their life in the cold." He led her to the car, the manager watching from the doorway with a stunned, resentful expression. The driver, a man accustomed to Damien's silent, solitary travels, opened the door without a word, his face a mask of professional discretion. The ride was silent, a journey across the invisible borders of the city. At a 5-star hotel, Damien escorted her to the front desk, his presence silencing the receptionist's questioning stare. He handled everything with a detached, ruthless efficiency, securing a suite and arranging for food to be delivered immediately. He walked her to the elevator, handing her a key card. "Rest," he said, his voice softer now. "Someone will be in touch tomorrow morning. This is not a permanent solution, but it is a start." He did not wait for a reply, turning and walking away before the fragile connection between them could break him further. The next morning, after a night in a bed softer than any she could remember, a call came. It was a woman named Clara, the director of a charitable foundation Damien funded. Her tone was kind but professional, treating Elena not as a charity case, but as a client. The offer was laid out with stunning clarity. A small but clean, fully furnished apartment in a secure building was waiting for her. All medical expenses for the remainder of her pregnancy and the birth would be covered. A monthly stipend would be provided to ensure she and the baby wanted for nothing. Elena listened, her hand resting on her belly, tears silently streaming down her face. It was too much. A tidal wave of grace in a life defined by scarcity. It was the answer to a prayer she had been too exhausted to even whisper. But the final offer was what truly restored her. "Mr. Velez also wanted to offer you a position," Clara explained gently. "As an administrative assistant here at the foundation, the hours will be flexible, and you would only start after the baby is born and you feel ready." It was more than a home, more than money. It was a purpose. It was a chance to stand on her own 2 feet, to earn her own way, to build a future for her child with her own hands. Damien Velez hadn't just given her shelter. He had given her back her dignity. He had looked past the dirt and desperation and seen not a problem to be erased, but a mother to be empowered. In accepting his help, Elena was not surrendering. She was finally being given the tools she needed to fight her own battles. Justice had arrived, not as a verdict, but as an open door. 6 months later, the city's cold breath could no longer touch her. Elena stood in a room bathed in the soft, milky light of a new morning, a space she had painted the color of a pale yellow sunrise. It was a nursery, a sanctuary of hope built from the ashes of her despair. In her arms, a tiny, perfect life slept soundly. Her son, Matteo. His small breaths were the quietest, most powerful sound in her world. The key to this apartment, this life, lay on a small table by the door, a constant gleaming reminder of the night a stranger's broken heart had decided to mend hers. She was no longer the invisible woman from the alley. She was a mother. She was home. And for the first time, the future felt not like a threat to be survived, but a promise to be lived. In a penthouse high above the city, Damien Velez held a framed photograph of a smiling woman with eyes full of light. For 10 years, looking at Amelia's face had been an act of self-flagellation, a reminder of all he had lost. But today the memory was different. It was a gentle ache, not a gaping wound. The thought of Elena and her son didn't replace his grief, but it gave it purpose. He had spent a decade building an empire of glass and steel, a monument to his emptiness. Now, he was funding futures, building shelters, creating second chances. He had learned that compassion was not a weakness, but a different kind of strength, the kind that doesn't conquer the world Akar but heals it, one small broken piece at a time. The silence in his home was no longer a void, but a quiet space for reflection. He arrived at her door not as a benefactor, but as a hesitant guest. In his hands, he held a small hand-carved wooden bird, a simple gift that spoke more than 1,000 expensive toys ever could. When Elena opened the door, she greeted him not with gratitude, but with a quiet, welcoming smile. She was transformed, her face glowing with a peaceful confidence that erased the last traces of the haunted woman from the alley. She led him inside, into the warmth and light of the home she had created. He saw the nursery, the tiny clothes folded neatly, the love that filled every corner of the small apartment. For a man who owned skyscrapers, this humble space felt more real, more valuable than anything in his portfolio. It was a testament to the fact that his life's greatest transaction had involved no money at all. Elena sat on the sofa, gently rocking Matteo in her arms. Damien watched from a distance, a silent observer of a miracle he had helped set in motion. "Would you like to hold him?" she asked softly, her voice free of any obligation. The question was an offering, an invitation into a world he had long believed was permanently closed to him. He nodded, his movement stiff and uncertain as he took the small warm bundle into his arms. The baby stirred but did not wake, a trusting weight against his chest. Looking down at that innocent face, Damien felt the last fortress of his grief crumble into dust. This was not the ghost of the son he had lost. This was the tangible proof of a life he had helped save. In that moment, he was not a magnate or a mourner. He was just a man, holding hope. As he gently handed the baby back, their eyes met, and in that shared glance, a decade of pain and a lifetime of struggle found a quiet resolution. "His middle name is Damien," Elena said, her voice steady and clear. The words were not a payment, but a gift of honor, a recognition that he had given her son more than a home. He had given him a future. Damien felt a profound, unfamiliar warmth spread through his chest, a feeling he had thought long dead. He couldn't speak, so he simply nodded, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. He saw the key by the door, no longer just a piece of metal, but a symbol of the door he had opened within himself. He had come to check on an investment and had found his own redemption instead. He left as quietly as he had arrived. Elena stood in the doorway, her son nestled securely in her arms, and watched him walk down the hall. She was not watching a savior, but a fellow survivor. The alley, the hunger, the humiliation. They were all part of her story, but they were no longer the whole story. She looked down at Matteo's sleeping face, her heart overflowing with a love so fierce it left no room for bitterness. The world had tried to break her, had thrown her away like trash, but it had failed. She had found her strength not in fighting the world, but in building her own. In the end, a mother's love had not only saved her child, it had healed a king. If this story moved you, subscribe to our channel and send this video to someone who needs to believe in hope.